On a gray November afternoon in 2024, a hiker named David Brennan was descending a narrow ridge in the Appalachian Mountains of northern Pennsylvania when his boot caught on a rusted steel peg half buried in moss. Beneath 40 years of leaf litter and weathered canvas, an abandoned tent emerged, collapsed, decomposed, forgotten. What Brennan discovered inside the deteriorated shelter would set off a chain of investigations that forced the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection and 3 mining companies to confront a disappearance they had officially closed in 1982. Brennan was not a casual tourist. He was a former mine surveyor who recognized the peg as a professional surveying marker, the type used by geological teams decades earlier. He photographed the site with his phone, noted the GPS coordinates with precision, and called the local ranger station. Within hours, the discovery had moved from a hiker's curiosity to a forensic case. The tent itself bore the markings of industrial-grade equipment, a canvas Eureka model, 1970s manufacture, with reinforced grommets and a manufacturer's stamp faded but still readable. The frame was aluminum, corroded but intact. Around the shelter's perimeter, the vegetation had grown through the fabric in a pattern suggesting the tent had been sealed and undisturbed for decades. There were no animal disturbances, no scavenger marks, no signs of looting. It had simply been swallowed by the forest. Inside, the first discovery was methodical. A single backpack, tan canvas with leather straps, hung from an internal hook. The fabric had mostly dissolved into a papery shell, but within it lay the unmistakable form of a survey kit. A theodolite wrapped in oilcloth, brass instruments corroded green with patina, and a leather-bound ledger. The pages were damp and buckled, but the entries were legible. Each page bore dates, coordinates, and depth measurements in a precise, controlled hand. The last entry was dated March 17, 1982. Below it, a single line remained unfinished. Mid-sentence, the pen abandoned. Dr. James Matthews, a senior mining archaeologist at Penn State University, was contacted by the Pennsylvania Historical Commission on November 8, 2024. Matthews had spent 30 years studying the industrial history of Appalachian mining operations, and he immediately understood what the discovery suggested. Someone had been conducting geological surveys in these mountains in the early 1980s, had abandoned their equipment and vanished, and the case had apparently been buried alongside the tent. Matthews drove to the site with his graduate students and a portable preservation unit. The temperature at the ridge was 4 degrees Celsius, and a thin rain moved through the gaps in the canopy. The team worked in latex gloves under a temporary awning, carefully extracting the artifacts. Beyond the ledger and the theodolite, they found a Nikon FM2 camera with several undeveloped rolls of film still in the back, sealed in an airtight container. There was also a Coleman sleeping bag, a thermos still half filled with black coffee oxidized to a dark resin, and a small metal box containing 32 cigarette stubs arranged in a neat row, as if counted obsessively. But the discovery that made Matthews actually freeze was the document beneath the sleeping bag. It was a carbon copy of an internal memorandum, dated March 12, 1982, from the Consolidated Coal Corporation to the Pennsylvania Bureau of Mines. The letterhead was official, the memo numbered, and the content was technical and unambiguous. It instructed the survey team to cease all measurements and reports related to subsurface instability in a section of the Laurel Ridge Formation, and to consolidate all field data into a single master ledger to be retained at headquarters. The memo was signed by a vice president whose name had been carefully scratched out with a razor blade, but the signature remained partially visible: R. Castellano. The ledger entries revealed why the survey had been urgent and apparently why it had been terminated. The measurements showed an accelerating collapse in an abandoned shaft system beneath 300 feet of overburden. The angles suggested that a fault line was shifting, that water was pooling in inaccessible cavities, and that the risk to the surface, where a small housing development called Meadowbrook Estates had been surveyed but not yet built, was not negligible. One entry, written in underlined capitals, read, "Subsidence probable within 18 months if remediation not attempted." The next entry, 3 days later, was blank except for a question mark. The undeveloped film was processed by the university's conservation lab. 42 photographs emerged, grainy but unmistakable. They showed a measuring team at the ridge, a young man with a beard and a surveyor's vest performing calculations at a tripod, and close-ups of a visible fissure in the exposed rock face, photographed with a scale ruler placed beside it for reference. One photograph, taken from inside the tent, showed a wall map of the Laurel Ridge area with red circles drawn around 3 locations. Beside each circle was handwritten text: Risk Zone A, Risk Zone B, Risk Zone C. By the evening of the first day, Matthews understood the skeleton of what had happened. A geologist or surveyor, the photographs suggested a man in his early 30s, had been conducting an urgent environmental assessment in March 1982. His findings were unfavorable. He had documented them meticulously. And then, on March 17th, his work had stopped. His tent had been abandoned. His film had been left undeveloped. His coffee had been left to petrify in its thermos. And for 42 years, no one had found him. No one had retrieved his data, and no one had acknowledged that the survey had ever occurred. The identification of the surveyor took 3 days. Matthews forwarded the photographs to the Pennsylvania Bureau of Mines Archives, and within 48 hours, a retired records clerk named Patricia Cole contacted the university. She recognized the face in the expedition photographs. His name was Richard Harmon, age 31 at the time of disappearance, employed by Consolidated Coal Corporation as a field geologist specializing in subsurface hydrology. According to the personnel file, Harmon had been reported missing on March 21, 1982, by his sister Janet Harmon Rossi, who lived in Pittsburgh. An official search was conducted for 6 weeks. No body was found. The case was closed as a voluntary disappearance. A man lost in the mountains, presumed dead or fled. But the ledger recovered from the tent proved something else entirely. The handwriting analysis, conducted by a forensic document examiner in Philadelphia, confirmed with 94% certainty that all entries in the ledger were written by the same person. The progression of the handwriting showed no signs of deterioration or distress. It was methodical, it was professional, and it ended abruptly on March 17, 1982, mid-sentence, in the phrase, "Water infiltration suggests cavitation at depth." Matthews requested the original case file from the Pennsylvania State Police. What arrived was a thin folder. The investigation had consisted of 3 interviews, a brief search of Harmon's apartment in Scranton, and a cursory sweep of the Ridge area where his vehicle was found abandoned 2 miles from where his tent now stood. The concluding report, filed by a state trooper named Gerald Nance, stated simply, "No evidence of foul play detected. Presumed lost hiker or voluntary disappearance. Case closed pending evidence." But there was one detail that Matthews had not expected. In the margins of the police report, in handwriting different from the typed text, someone had written, "Note, Consolidated Coal contacted Department RE file confidentiality. See attached memo from company attorney." The attached memo instructed the state police to limit public disclosure of details related to the investigation to preserve the company's proprietary geological interests. There was no signature on the instruction, but it bore the Consolidated Coal letterhead. Janet Harmon Rossi was 78 years old and lived in a residential community outside Pittsburgh. When Matthews called her on November 11, 2024, she wept. She had not spoken about her brother's disappearance in decades. She told Matthews what the police files did not record. Richard had called her on March 14, 1982, 3 days before he vanished. He told her he had made a discovery that was serious and that he was not sure what to do about it. He said people at the company were pressuring him to bury the findings. She asked him what findings. He said he couldn't say over the phone. He said he would decide what to do after the weekend. She never heard from him again. On November 12th, Matthews and his team requested access to the Consolidated Coal Corporation's archived records, which had been transferred to a climate-controlled facility in Columbus, Ohio, after the company declared bankruptcy in 1998. What emerged over the following week was a sequence of internal documents that reinterpreted the disappearance entirely. The first was a memorandum dated March 15, 1982, from Richard Castellano, Vice President of Operations, to the Chief Financial Officer, stating that pending geological survey of Laurel Ridge may yield unfavorable results that could impede Meadowbrook Estates development approval and financing. The memorandum requested immediate review of survey team protocols and possible data consolidation measures. The second document was a handwritten note, discovered in Castellano's personal file, dated March 16, 1982. Spoke with Harmon. He is resistant. Need alternative approach. Will arrange meeting at Ridge location to discuss company position data submission procedures. The third document was a formal memo dated March 20, 1982, 3 days after Harmon's disappearance. reassigning the Laurel Ridge project to a new surveyor named Paul Dietrich. The memo stated that Harmon had voluntarily withdrawn from active fieldwork due to unspecified personal circumstances, and that his preliminary data should be consolidated into a master file for internal review only. Matthews contacted the State Police Archives in Harrisburg. He requested any further correspondence regarding Richard Harmon's case after the official closure. What they found was a single letter, dated April 15, 1982, from a company attorney representing Consolidated Coal to the Pennsylvania Bureau of Mines. The letter stated that the company had accepted the resignation of geologist Richard Harmon and that it was preserving all associated data as proprietary information. The tone was definitive. It closed the discussion. What happened next revealed the true scope of what Harmon had discovered. Meadowbrook Estates was approved by the Pennsylvania Department of Community Affairs in June 1982, less than 3 months after Harmon's disappearance. Construction began in September 1982. By 1985, 83 homes had been built in the development, with a population of approximately 240 residents. They knew nothing of the geological survey, the warning about subsidence, or the man who had vanished. In 1987, 5 years after the supposed survey deadline, the first crack appeared in the foundation of a home in Meadowbrook Estates. It was minor. By 1991, 3 homes had sustained significant structural damage. By 1998, the entire development was condemned. Consolidated Coal paid a settlement of $2.3 million to the residents, attributed to undisclosed subsurface conditions. Richard Harmon's name appeared nowhere in the settlement documentation. His warnings had been erased. His data had been buried. The forensic examination of the tent site revealed details that shifted the investigation from disappearance to coercion. On November 15, 2024, a specialized team from the Pennsylvania State Police Evidence Recovery Unit arrived at the ridge with ground-penetrating radar and soil analysis equipment. What they discovered beneath the tent's foundation was a pattern of disturbance inconsistent with natural settling. The soil showed signs of repeated foot traffic in a confined radius, approximately 8 feet in diameter around the tent's center. The ground samples contained elevated levels of potassium chloride, consistent with human perspiration, in abnormally high concentrations. The area directly beneath the sleeping bag contained trace quantities of a sedative pharmaceutical, diazepam, or Valium. More troubling was the physical evidence inside the tent itself. The thermos with the petrified coffee showed microscopic scratches on its interior surface, suggesting repeated use and refilling. The 32 cigarette stubs, upon laboratory analysis, revealed they spanned a period of approximately 5 to 7 days, not a single night. The filter paper contained markers of metabolic stress, elevated cortisol compounds in the tar residue. The sleeping bag, when examined under ultraviolet light, displayed trace evidence of restraint marks, linear abrasions on the zipper track, and subtle fibrillation of the canvas consistent with rope friction. Matthews contacted Robert Chen, a former colleague of Richard Harmon at Consolidated Coal. Chen was now 84 years old and living in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. When interviewed on November 18th, Chen provided a statement that reframed everything. He said that on March 16, 1982, Richard Harmon had come to him in distress. Harmon said that Richard Castellano and 2 company security personnel had arrived at the Ridge camp that morning with a direct instruction: either agree to classify all survey findings as inconclusive or face termination and a lawsuit for breach of proprietary contract. Chen recalled that Harmon refused. Chen also recalled that Harmon had said, "If I sign their statement, 200 people die. I won't do it." That afternoon, Castellano and the security personnel returned to the Ridge. Chen was not present. Harmon told Chen by radio the next morning that he had agreed to reconsider the data and would file a revised report, but then the radio went silent. Chen reported Harmon missing on March 19, 1982. He was interviewed by state police, but his account was recorded and filed away. When the case was closed 4 months later, Chen was never contacted again. The breakthrough came on November 21st from an unexpected source. A woman named Patricia Dubois, now 79, contacted Matthews after seeing a news brief about the discovery. Dubois had been one of the first residents of Meadowbrook Estates. In 1982, she had attended a community meeting where a representative from Consolidated Coal assured buyers that the land had been thoroughly surveyed and was geologically sound. Dubois was a certified paralegal. She kept meticulous records. She produced a handwritten note from that meeting, dated September 8, 1982, in which the company representative had claimed that all preliminary geological studies indicated no subsurface risks. The representative's name, printed on the meeting agenda, was Richard Castellano, but Dubois had also kept another document. In her personal papers, she had a photocopy of a geological assessment that a friend had obtained through unofficial channels in 1983, a preliminary survey suggesting possible instability in Laurel Ridge Formation. She had never pursued it because, she said, she was afraid. She was afraid of the company. She was afraid of being sued. She was afraid of losing her home. She had lived in that home for 37 years before the structural damage forced her to abandon it in 1998. She had paid for repairs out of pocket. She had watched her investment collapse, and she had never known why. On November 25th, a retired Consolidated Coal security officer named Marcus Webb came forward. Webb had worked for the company's internal security division from 1978 to 1989. He was now 86 and suffering from terminal cancer. He gave a deposition to the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office that would become central to understanding what occurred on March 16 and 17, 1982. Webb stated that he and another security officer, now deceased, had been instructed by Richard Castellano to accompany him to the Laurel Ridge survey site on March 16. The stated purpose was to retrieve survey equipment. Upon arrival, they found Richard Harmon alone in the tent, reviewing his data. Castellano presented Harmon with a written statement prepared by the company's legal department, falsifying the survey conclusions to indicate no geological risk. Harmon refused to sign. An argument ensued. Castellano left the tent. Webb and the other officer remained. Webb said they were instructed to ensure Harmon remained available until he reconsidered his position. Webb said they did not physically restrain him, but they made clear that departure was not an option. Webb said they remained at the site through the night and into the next day. Webb said that on March 17th in the early morning, Harmon told them he needed to use the radio to file a report with company headquarters. They allowed him to do so, supervised. Webb said that Harmon's hands were shaking so badly he could barely operate the device. Webb said that at approximately 9:47 a.m. on March 17th, Richard Harmon walked away from the tent toward the tree line. Webb said Castellano, who had returned to the site that morning, instructed them not to follow. Webb said Harmon never returned. Webb said they waited 4 hours. Then they packed the tent, erased the campsite as best they could, and left. Webb said Castellano told them that if they ever spoke about the incident, their pensions would be forfeited, and they would face criminal prosecution for interfering with company operations. Webb said that for 42 years, he had honored that threat. The deposition of Marcus Webb triggered an intensive criminal investigation coordinated by the Pennsylvania Attorney General's Office and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. On December 3, 2024, search and rescue teams, accompanied by cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar operators, began a systematic sweep of the area surrounding the tent site. The search radius was expanded to 3 miles, encompassing the ridgeline, the adjacent forest, and the ravines that descended toward the valley below. For 17 days, teams moved through the winter terrain with methodical precision. On December 19th, at a depth of 43 feet in a ravine approximately 1.2 miles from the tent site, they discovered human remains. The skeleton was incomplete. Weather, predation, and geological processes had dispersed portions over 4 decades, but the forensic anthropologist who examined the remains, Dr. Sandra Reeves from the Smithsonian Institution, was able to establish with high confidence that the bones belonged to a male, aged 30 to 35 at time of death, with a left femur fracture consistent with a fall from significant height. The dental records, cross-referenced with Richard Harmon's military service file, provided confirmation. The remains were those of Richard Harmon. The cause of death was determined to be traumatic injuries sustained from the fall, with contributing factors of hypothermia and dehydration. The time of death was estimated at March 17, 1982, plus or minus 3 days. But the ravine contained more than bones. Lodged between 2 boulders, sealed in a waterproof metal box, was a leather journal. The pages were deteriorated but legible. The handwriting was Richard Harmon's. The first entry in the journal, dated March 16, 1982, read, "They want me to lie. I told them no. Now they say I cannot leave. Castellano has gone. The security men are outside. I am writing this in case something happens. The survey is real, the risk is real. 200 people will live above a collapsing void. I cannot sign their lie. The journal contained 7 more entries spanning 5 days. March 17th. Still here. No food except what I brought. They brought coffee this morning. It tasted wrong. I drank it anyway. I needed to sleep. March 18th. I told them I would reconsider. They smiled. Castellano came back. He brought papers again. More lies. I said I would think about it. He said I had until tomorrow. He said that if I cooperated, everything would be fine. If I didn't, I would never work in geology again. He said worse things too. He said I would regret my principles. March 19th. I can't stay here anymore. I told them I needed to walk. They said no. I waited until dark. The guard outside fell asleep. I took the radio, the one they wouldn't let me use, and I walked toward the edge. I wanted to radio the authorities. I wanted someone to know what I found. I wasn't thinking clearly. The sedative they gave me in the coffee, I can feel it still, making everything slow and heavy. I can see the lights of the valley below. Maybe I can reach a phone. Maybe I can tell someone before it's too late. March 21st. I am writing this by the radio I found. I am hurt. I fell. It was dark and I couldn't see and the trail just ended. I think my leg is broken. It's very cold. The radio doesn't work. I think I walked the wrong direction. I am very cold now. The final entry was dated March 23rd, and it consisted of a single sentence. I'm sorry, Janet. I'm sorry I let them stop me. On January 8, 2025, a grand jury in Luzerne County indicted Richard Castellano, age 87, on charges of manslaughter, reckless endangerment, and conspiracy to cover up environmental violations. The investigation revealed that Castellano had died in 1996, but his estate was pursued for civil restitution. The secondary security officer, whose name was William Garrett, was also indicted posthumously. He had died in 2001. The investigation also uncovered that at least 3 members of the Pennsylvania Bureau of Mines had been aware, at some level, that Harmon's data had been suppressed. 2 of those individuals had died. The third, a retired inspector named Howard Kester, age 91, confessed in a written statement that he had received a letter from Consolidated Coal requesting confidential handling of the Laurel Ridge survey, and that he had complied without independent verification. He expressed profound regret. On February 14, 2025, a federal court approved a settlement of $12 million derived from Consolidated Coal's remaining assets and insurance claims to be distributed to the families of Meadowbrook Estates residents and to the Harmon family. Janet Harmon Rossi received a personal apology from the Pennsylvania Attorney General, delivered at a memorial service held at the state capitol. The court also mandated the publication of a formal historical record of the Laurel Ridge Geological Survey, including Harmon's original field notes, photographs, and all company memoranda relating to the suppression of the data. Richard Harmon's remains were interred in a private ceremony on March 17, 2025, exactly 43 years after his death. A bronze marker was installed at the ridge where his tent had been discovered, bearing his name, his dates, and a single inscription: Geologist, Witness, Conscience. The Pennsylvania Bureau of Mines established the Richard Harmon Award for Environmental Integrity, to be granted annually to scientists who expose risks despite institutional pressure. On a cold afternoon in April 2025, Dr. James Matthews stood at the ridge with Janet Harmon Rossi. The forest had already begun to obscure the site, drawing it back into the landscape. The wind moved through the bare branches with a hollow sound. Harmon Rossi placed her hand on the bronze marker and said nothing. Matthews understood that the discovery of her brother's tent and the truth it contained had not resolved anything fundamental. It had only made visible what had always been true: that institutions will suppress inconvenient facts, that conscience is sometimes fatal, and that the only remedy for buried truths is the discipline to excavate them, regardless of how much time has passed or how deep the silence has grown.